Johnny Ryan, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We have almost traditional meetings on annual basis, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. You never worked for Oracle, but in many areas of digital markets and digital economy, you are an oracle. You thematize, explain in simple, approachable fashion the technical issues which underpin the development of digital markets. I remember very vividly how convincing and appealing your messages to the European members of the European Parliament were about the importance of programmatic advertising and how much is going on behind the industry, the machinery of online advertising more generally. And thus, I wanted to use this opportunity to invite you to reflect upon the issues which are in our kind of mainstream discussions about the functioning of digital markets, but also to channel us to the things which will become the mainstream in a couple of years' time, perhaps. The first topic for today's conversation is the relationship between the Digital Markets Act and GDPR. A lot is going on in theoretical aspects as well as in practical aspects. Your position on this, please.
Oles, thank you for that. That's very kind. You mentioned programmatic advertising, also known as real-time bidding. By the time this episode where we are talking is published by you, there will have been a story just published by 404 Media, so I'm not scooping them. And what 404 have found is proof in the form of a document from the US Border Police that ICE is using real-time bidding data about people and where they are to apprehend individuals. So it's just another, yet another and another, but it's the latest reminder of just how dangerous this leakage of advertising data is for people, including Europeans who happen to visit the United States. But data are being leaked out about Europeans at home here too. Now, you asked about the GDPR and the DMA. Well, first, I'm not at all optimistic about the prospects of DMA enforcement. So I think my feeling going back quite some time is that if we weren't able to apply the GDPR, and we didn't do it. It hasn't been applied in any meaningful way. And if DG Comp has not delivered in the digital market, and they also haven't, which is why we have the DMA, I didn't see how we were going to get results under the DMA. I mean, I was open to the possibility that that might happen, and I know that there are good people on the DMA team and they're well-meaning. But the political calculation, when a decision from that team makes its way to the president of the commission, the political calculation will be, is this something that Mr. Trump can live with? We're not yet, if we will be able ever, we're not yet in a position to defy him on almost any grounds. Certainly not on the application of law on our own soil. So I don't think that the DMA really, at this point, is worth considering. That may change in the future. It may provide useful tools when there is the political will to use them. I see that Stéphanie Yoncourtin, a very prominent French MEP, is proposing a politically entirely independent competition authority. Now, in theory, that is what DG Comp is, but in practice, it is not what it is, clearly. And you can see why some people are proposing that there should be a new structure for political independence. So I don't really think it's worth spending too much time thinking about the Digital Markets Act. I have always thought that the original sin, well, one of the original sins in the digital sphere is the failure to apply the GDPR. Now, there are other original sins that are far older, such as finishing the single market, having a capital union, and so on, so that we can grow our own technological bets. But beyond that, if we have not applied very simple principles in the GDPR, such as purpose limitation and data minimization on companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, where in some of them there is a manifest infringement of purpose limitation, I really don't think we can claim credibly that we will do much else. I know this is a long answer, but let me just elaborate on purpose limitation. So purpose limitation is an old idea. I've talked with you about it before. It dates back to at least the 1970s. In European law, it has been in declarations from the Council of Europe, I think, since the mid-70s. And it was in the Data Protection Directive from 1995. So purpose limitation says, if you give me your data, I'm a company, for one particular use, I don't automatically get to use those data for something else. Even inside my subsidiary, if I'm part of a conglomerate. Now, the DMA says, roughly, big chunks of the company can't pass data around freely. So the DMA has a cruder form of that. It says big chunks, core services of a company or big subsidiaries of a conglomerate can't throw data around within the conglomerate. But the GDPR says even within those subsidiaries, where they're using data for many different purposes, they do not freely get to use data that they might have got on the merits for good reason. For one purpose, they don't get to automatically use that for some other purpose. So DMA would say YouTube cannot automatically share data with maps within Google. The GDPR would say YouTube cannot automatically share some data about you with itself for other reasons. And if you look inside Google or Meta, actually what you have is a total free-for-all of data. We now know this because we've seen so much material leak out about them through court cases. It's very clear that they have very, very poor internal accounting for what they do with data. So what that means is, first, of course, they can't really comply with the DMA except in the broadest possible terms, right? We're going to have, big silos where we must under the DMA. But actually, we don't really know what our business is doing with data. So we certainly can't comply with purpose limitation under the GDPR. And the next element is, if you don't know what you're doing with data, and if you're reusing data for lots of different purposes that you've no legal basis to do that, so it's illegal, and those other data, or the same data that are being reused, you shouldn't have them. There shouldn't be, let's say, that copy or linkage of data. There's another principle called data minimization. And that means if there isn't a particular reason, which is an acceptable reason for you to use the data, you shouldn't have it. It should be gone. You only have it for as long as is absolutely necessary in the particular context where it's justifiable. So there's two fundamental principles. If you cannot account for what you're doing with data internally, and imagine I was saying you are a big multinational firm, one of the biggest in the world, and you're not accounting for what you do with money. It's very similar. If you've no internal accounting, then you certainly cannot provide external transparency. You can't tell the person whose data you're using what you're doing with their data. So how then are you going to ask the person for permission for your use of the data when you don't even know what you're doing? So you can't get a legal basis. You can't get consent. You can't tell them what you're doing with the data. You don't know what you're doing with the data. You can't minimize it. You've no purpose limitation control. It's a total free-for-all. If we haven't policed those really fundamental things, data, we're really only at the very beginning of enforcement in any domain. Because if you enforced in those areas, a whole lot of competition issues would not materialize or disappear. And a whole lot of content issues would not materialize or disappear as well. So when you fail on data protection, you create problems for other regulatory domains. That was an incredibly long answer to a very concise question.
That's a very not particularly long answer, very informative answer, and yet the proposition from which you start your kind of normative maximalism, perhaps, it requires further clarification for me. So I wanted to ask you a clarificatory question. If you say that we didn't the GDPR didn't deliver, even if despite the fact that the requirements were even more categorical than those which are present in Article 5.2 of the DMA, for example, basically your your normative position concerns data sovereignty and from the European perspective, and more humanistic perspective, the vigilance about misuse and excessive use of data by the largest companies in general, but by all companies pretty much in this digital universe, emergent digital universe. Don't you? Isn't it too maximalist? Do you? So you, because my understanding of the DMA is that we want a targeted intervention, kind of quasi almost punitive nature, to slow down in some aspects the designated undertakings, rather than changing the natural law of how the things are functioning. And you embark on the journey of rather kind of idealistic attempts to change how the things in digital world integrate with each other. Is my understanding correct? And if it is correct,
I don't think so. No, I think you're misapprehending what I'm presenting. We decided in the 70s, in the United States and in Europe, we decided that magnetic tape, which meant you could have long-term records about everyone, and that those records could be very rapidly consulted. Magnetic tape, health records, social security numbers, and so on, and credit ratings. We decided that we needed to start to institute rules as society became computerized, as they would have called it back then. And that if you had a total free-for-all of information about people, that would be catastrophic. So certain things should be secret, certain things should not be secret. And things that were in the middle should be handled in a very particular way. Now, this is common sense. No one would disagree with those principles that date back to the 70s. And they are at the core of the data protection law that we have and that we have failed to apply. What I'm suggesting is that we should apply our law, that the law is very clear, the principles are clear, they're common sense, and you can explain them to the person on the street and they understand them. And having seen some of these companies' own research, when they then survey their own customers to see what they're worried about, their customers are worried about the consequences of failing to apply those protections. So none of this is radical. It's actually deeply conservative. It is half a century old. Is it just about digital sovereignty? No, certainly not. We would not have been worried about digital sovereignty up until quite recently, not particularly worried. The Russians and the Chinese have been for a long time. Europeans have generally not. We might not even have been worried about protecting our children up until the last 5 years, 6 years. And up until around about that period, we might not have been worried about the collapse of journalism, maybe up until about 8 years ago. when it became clear that the data free-for-all was a problem for online advertising, and that it was essentially a cancer on expensive to produce content. And up until fairly recently, we weren't too worried about national security either. And we weren't worried about competition. And I think I could throw in a few more problems we weren't worried about. So you could start off with, let's apply the law we have because it's based on common sense principles. But because we haven't applied the law, the reasons to start applying the law, competition, national security, European competitiveness, etc., child protection, they start to stack up. So let me give you one example. I was at a round table with senior German officials a few months ago. And Berlin has been pushing the idea that if we reduced the burden that European companies face, or any company in Europe faces, to train data, to train LLMs on personal data, if we reduce that burden, we would potentially help European competitiveness by allowing European AI firms to catch up with their Chinese and US counterparts. Let me give you the counter to that. Here is why reducing the burden is absolutely against competitiveness from Europe's perspective in reality. Microsoft, Google, Meta, these companies have a huge internal free-for-all of data, and all the data that they have is so huge that no European competitor is likely to catch up unless something very and deeply, staggeringly surprising occurs. We can all accept that. That is not controversial. Now, those American firms, they are using all of those data to train AI because they have an internal data free-for-all. And the answer, if you want a European company to catch up to them, is not to say, okay, European firm, you can now use the small amount of data you have without too many legal strings attached. That's not the answer. The answer is to apply the law against the other companies who wouldn't have that head start if we had applied the law. They are allowed to have some of the data they have for purposes that they collected the data for, but they are not allowed to use it for AI. Obviously, it's a simple principle. So their head start comes because we never enforced the rules. And we never enforced the rules because all of those companies are policed by Ireland, where I happen to be right now, where I live. And, there are very good reasons why Ireland is not in the business of robustly enforcing those laws. But if you're Berlin and you want a German Mistral to appear from nowhere and have a head start against their Chinese and US firms, you have two options. One is you investigate in frugal AI. The US approach is let's burn through as much data as possible, as expensively as possible. And everyone is praying that there's money at the end of that rainbow. I happen to have moved my pension out of any stock related to that sector because I think it's insanity. It's, this is tulips territory. Almost certainly. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd be surprised. So one option is don't follow the Americans into the bonfire. The second option is if you want to follow the Americans into the bonfire, and if you think it's about data scale, then what you do is you stop them from dominating that game by virtue of having broken your law. And that means political pressure on Ireland to uphold European law and apply it to these firms.
Okay. In this regard, the first question, how important, in your view, the amount of data which big tech generates in Europe is? How much is at stake? Assuming that they will be compliant with strict requirements of GDPR plus, how much would it change? Cannot they just do the same elsewhere?
Well, I don't know about that. Part of that question is, how much of a force in the world is Europe? The answer today is not much. But that's not the answer I would have given you 3 years ago. We did not just have power taken from us, we allowed power to be taken from us. And I think we can take quite a lot of it back and maybe grow it. So the answer to that question today is not much, but I don't know what the answer might be in 2 years, depending how we go about things. There were certain things in the Draghi report that I agree with. And those are the most painful things for our political leaders to grapple with. And they are not necessarily fully engaging with them yet. I'm not saying we should cripple US and Chinese firms globally. I'm saying if you want to start using the European market as not just as an export platform, but if you want to become a consumption market and bring down the barriers between each member state and actually have a proper single market where a European startup in Dublin can scale into a market of 450 million people, well, then you're thinking in a different way. It's okay for an American company to abide by US law, which is very, very lax, and be very big in the United States. Have at it. But if we're going to have a European market that is capable of sustaining things that scale across the borders of member states, which is not what we have today, well, the first thing we need to do is not just bring down those barriers between markets. It's also to stop non-EU firms from dominating our market by breaking our law in our own market. Now, the first part of your question, though, was, could we have a global impact? Yes, we could if we worked at it. There could be a Brussels effect. There hasn't been, but there certainly could be. But again, this is about having a strategic idea about what the European market is for and what it's going to be, and paying the political costs of walking that path.
I see the point, and that's very convincing answer. The fact that you cannot in one day change everything, the global constellation of superpower doesn't mean that you should just sit on your hands and doing nothing and complaining about things. You have to start.
Yeah, no, actually, I think in one day you could, by the way. So in November, I wrote maybe it might be a provocative piece, but I had a piece in The Guardian. It's one of a series I've been writing. And this piece gave an example of what Europe could do in a day. If we really decided, okay, enough is enough. We have decided, Donald, that we are coming for you. We are going to grab you in the locker room. You are going to feel what it's like, and you will not like it. And I gave an example of the kinds of things that we could do. One was go super heavy on Dublin and on Luxembourg. Luxembourg, like Ireland, is a haven for tech firms to operate with impunity across Europe. And in their case, the big offender is Amazon. But if you dropped a bomb on Dublin and Amazon, right, as the other major capitals and the Commission together, and you said, okay, enough's enough. None of this. We are going to come down heavy on you. We're going to start talking about it. We're going to start putting pressure on you, etc. No more favors like Brexit and the support we gave you. It's over. We're going to start bad-mouthing you. I think you would see a very rapid change. There's something in the Irish psyche that would respond rapidly to that. And you saw that in 2008 with the banking crisis. Irish people were crying out for more austerity. We didn't demonstrate in the streets. We instead said, yes, we have been sinners. Please allow us to still, sit at the table, and we will we will throw our grandchildren on the bonfire, even though it wasn't all our fault. So the first thing is, assuming there was maximal political will, which we are very far from, in a day, you could see a total change from at least one of the major havens, which is Ireland. And that would absolutely change the US system. And I'll explain why. And the second thing is, if you were willing to, yes, jeopardize some of our industrial sacred cows, like Zeiss lenses, for example, or ASML, the big machines that are essential to the TSMC chip fabrication, and on which NVIDIA ultimately relies. By unlocking enforcement by the havens, and by bringing in export controls, which certain member states would absolutely fight, but if you could do it, you would burst the AI bubble in a day in the US, and Donald Trump wouldn't have a hope of winning midterms. Now, the question is, would he then run midterms? But Europe, if it had maximal political will, can play hardball in all sorts of interesting ways. Those things are not on the table. They're not under consideration. We have so little political will. It's still softly, we will eventually hoodwink these Americans, but we have to play ball for the next while, seems to be the approach. And I think that's insanity.
Okay, the second part of this question is, regulators can do a lot. Regulatory, or let's say enforcement, mindful and enthusiastic enforcement can do a lot, but it cannot create European alternatives. So we must see somebody on the horizon who would be potential beneficiaries from a serious enforcement, from enforcing something which is already in our rule books. Do you think that those who would be, or first of all, do you see these potential beneficiaries who would somehow say, finally, we are in a more or less even conditions, and let us somehow accelerate and offer a fight to, or maybe to just let us scale up? And second part of the question, do you think that they have to do things differently? Is there any way to do things differently, or they just have to repeat it with some adjustments, the recipe of success shown by all big tech companies historically?
Well, that's a good question. It brings me back to when I was in an online advertising technology firm called PageFair. And we had formed the view, before the GDPR was applicable, that regulation would be enforced. This is what the signaling was from the authorities, certainly from the Commission. And what we did was we invented a new system for advertising online that would be compliant. It would work for publishers and advertisers, and it would not broadcast everyone's secrets all over the place to hundreds of companies or thousands of companies. And I remember meeting one of the key enforcers and saying, you must signal to the market that you will enforce, because if you don't, alternatives such as we will have no one to sell to. There will be a market failure. You'll find there's no alternative if you don't help create the need. And ultimately, no one bought the alternative because they all came to believe that they could hide behind the consent span, the cookie banners that have appeared on web pages and apps since the GDPR, and which I've been fighting in court for several years now. So you have to have enforcers who signal that they are going to enforce the law, or you're not going to get alternatives. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think for many of the things that the public sector needs, the private sector is already building them. Now, I'm not saying the public sector should be the one building them. I'm just saying that they are. So it was very, very widely reported that the French had replaced, for their 5.5 million person public sector, they had replaced Teams and Cisco and all of those video chat systems, like what we're using now, with a French-built government operated alternative. But that system is only one of an entire suite that the French public sector has built. It's called La Suite, actually. So they will ultimately be introducing an alternative to the entire Google or Microsoft suite for everyone in the French civil service. Now, maybe there are reasons in French law why they cannot compete with the private sector. I don't know. But that sounds like an attractive offer for an SME if they're looking for a very robust, compliant, well-tested, useful, smooth system. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the suite isn't as good as it seems to be. And there are several alternatives. OpenDesk is another alternative from, I think, Germany and Austria. So the public sector is already doing it because they feel they have to. At least in some areas, they're already doing it. As far as the private sector goes, we already have, for very basic things like Microsoft Office, which is, it's pretty basic tech. We already have quite a few alternatives. Nextcloud, LibreOffice. You can get a skin for LibreOffice, which is open source. You can get a skin for it that makes it look like Microsoft Office, so it's immediately familiar. But quite aside from the fact that alternatives to those particular systems exist, I just want to remind you all is how remedial that tech is. There was a guy who ran a laboratory at a place called Xerox PARC, P-A-R-C, Xerox PARC in the 60s and 70s. And his team invented the graphical user interface. They invented the mouse. They invented, almost everything that you're used to seeing on your screen. And you can find online a video with the title, "The Mother of All Demos," which is where this guy, Doug Engelbart, is showing collaborative editing in a word processor using a cursor. And the video is in black and white because it was shot in the 60s. Now, it was cutting edge back then, yes, but it hasn't been cutting edge since the 90s, really. So this is a point that Roger McNamee makes very well. Roger is a longtime tech investor. He was a big tech investor in Silicon Valley in the 90s and 2000s. He's the guy who introduced Zuckerberg to Sandberg. He was an early investor in Facebook. And then he was disillusioned and he wrote the book Zucked, which became a big bestseller. Roger's point is, most of the tech that companies and government uses today is 1990s or 2000s era tech. It's super achievable to recreate. And you'll notice that the investment community is buying out of enterprise software at the moment in a big way. I mean, this is what the market reporting is saying just this morning, that tech stocks tumbled again because the latest LLMs seem to be so capable of easily reproducing the software that those systems are based on. So yes, you can easily rebuild the tech that we use, but you need either the public sector to go and just do it, or you need the enforcement community to actually apply the law fairly and proportionately, which creates the space for the alternatives to emerge. And final thing to say, though, is that I haven't spoken about infrastructure. Can we build the infrastructure? Are we going to spend the money? And here we come to the 10 trillion euro sitting unused in European savings accounts. And finally, it looked like European leaders are getting to a point where actually we will have an instrument that frees that money up for investment in such things. I have a question in my mind about whether we need to be building data centers in the way that the Americans are. In Ireland, 22% of our electricity use is data centers. And maybe a decade and a half ago, I wrote something, maybe 2 decades ago, I can't remember. I think it was 2 decades ago. I wrote something promoting data centers in Ireland and saying, yes, we should be building these things. I mean, I no longer believe that was a sensible position. You know, as someone said to me recently, it was William Perrin, unless you're in the business of breeding guard dogs, data centers are not a good industry. They don't harm any humans. It's good for your engineers who build the thing, but after that, who benefits? Yeah, I don't know what the point of having these big data centers is. And if LLMs deliver on, I don't know, a tenth of what is claimed, maybe there's a rationale for the data centers, but I'm not convinced that they will deliver a tenth. There are certain things that they seem to be pretty good at, but there are many things that they just aren't.
Johnny, you started answering the first question with saying that you are not particularly enthusiastic or not particularly optimistic about the DMA. And you have provided several appealing arguments in support of your point. We yet see in the first years of the DMA enforcement a couple of cases, a couple of non-compliance decisions, and one of those non-compliance decisions concerns directly the area which you've been advocating for a very long time. So you've been opening this or kind of heralding about these issues before it became so popular, namely pay or consent scheme and overall the manipulation of consent, binary choice, and all the issues which are not so new from in terms of regulatory choices. Are you satisfied with how the things evolve in this area, or what are your views on this enforcement specific area?
I don't know. I'm not sure. The shorthand for that discussion is pay or okay, as in either you subscribe to the website and pay them a fee every month or year, or you let your shield down and let their 800 partners target you across the internet, not just on that site. And clearly, that is simply unlawful. So it is the lowest possible hanging fruit. What alarms me is that it is still a debate. And here, the data protection community has really not covered itself in glory. We had several of the the US German regional data authorities who decided that maybe it was okay to have this forced consent system. And that confused the entire thing. It meant that the board of European enforcers could not come to a common view. And so they fudged the matter. Instead of saying outright, this is totally unlawful. What you're asking people to consent to is unlawful. We've already got findings of fact in an EDP decision in the IAB Europe case that it is clearly a huge data protection risk in the EDPB's own words. And yet, maybe you can trade away your protections, in the face of that risk. So this is another case where a failure of data protection has led to a confusion for competition people. And we've had this in online advertising again and again and again. We've had it in the UK. We've had it in France. We've even had it with the Bundeskartellamt, and I think one of their decisions concerning Apple as well. So, Oleg, we have efforts. The new digital clearinghouse is the latest to bring competition people and data protection people together. But the problem is that the data protection people they're just unable to deliver in their own domain. And bringing them together with competition people until the data protection people actually start applying the law. I mean, I'm not sure what the benefit is. You need to have a political energy behind applying that law and a realization that applying that law is good for competitiveness, is good for national security, is good for protecting children and their mental health. And until you have that realization, you're going to have, and I realize these authorities are ostensibly entirely independent, but until you actually have political energy in that sector, you will not have a willing European Commission robustly going into member states and saying, actually apply the law as it's written, because the team in the Commission is pointed in the wrong direction too. And sorry, by the way, all of this sounds incredibly negative. I should give the little ray of hope courts. Because we have a right of action, a private right of action, we can litigate. Now, I can't take all the cases I want to take. For most of these companies, because their headquarters are in Dublin, it means our litigation, is bound to Dublin, because that's how you get a consequence across the entire European Economic Area. If there's an important company in another jurisdiction, we go to court there. But unfortunately, most of our litigation has to be in Dublin, and it is absurdly expensive. But that is the opportunity to finally force these companies to obey the law.
Maybe you can tell us more about recent cases or the most noticeable cases.
So ICCL, I run a unit called Enforce within the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, ICCL. And that organization is celebrating its 50th year this year. So the battle back then was against an oppressive state and an oppressive church. And I'll tell you, by the way, Oleg, as we go back through our archives to celebrate the history, we find the most incredible campaigns. Irish women were not allowed in the rest of a pub. They had to be in the snug, a particular area of the pub. They weren't allowed elsewhere, and often they weren't allowed to have a full pint. So our organization, together with Irish women who found this objectionable, would attend courts when every year publicans, people who run pubs, needed to renew their license. And we would protest and say, Judge, this commercial operator refuses to serve these people, across the building. So we've been engaged in all sorts of interesting campaigns over the last half century. One of the things that has changed recently is that the European Collective Redress Directive has introduced to Ireland a scheme that allows class actions for the first time ever. So now you have all of these tech firms who have placed all of their eggs in the Irish basket, except for Amazon, which is in Luxembourg. And initially, that meant they were in a place that didn't have class actions, but now we do. So last year, in the middle of last year, we launched the first ever class action in the country against Microsoft for programmatic advertising, real-time bidding. And we were able to move that case to the commercial court. The commercial court does not normally handle human rights cases, but our case has this commercial dimension. And the commercial court tends to produce decisions within a year. It's very, very quick, but it is expensive. What we're asking the court for is not damages for all of the people who've been affected by Microsoft's advertising system. What we're asking the court for is a simple injunction. Stop them. Tell them to stop broadcasting everyone's secrets. And Microsoft is a very interesting defendant because not only are they an advertising exchange, an ad auction, which you know very well, Oleg, but some of the listeners and watchers may not. So it's not just that Microsoft operates ad auctions on other people's websites. It is that Microsoft is also a publisher. So if you install Microsoft Windows, they will bundle Edge, their browser, with Windows again, as though the Explorer case never happened. And the first thing that happens when you load up Edge, is that it will bring you to a consent message that asks for consent for 800 or 900 companies on Microsoft Network, msn.com. So they are a publisher of that website. They're asking for consent for all of these partner firms in online advertising. But Microsoft is also an advertiser. So they're advertising their own products using these systems too. So they represent everyone in the chain. They're the ad tech company, they're the buyer of the ad space, they're the seller of the ad space. They're a very, very neat example. And you could think of it as a way, because I've tried to not pursue publishers for as long as I've been trying to change online advertising. I have tried to not go after publishers, even though they are guilty. It is a way for us to make a precedent that applies to publishers and advertisers and tech. And if we win in this case, the remedy we want from the court is not that Microsoft stop running advertising auctions, but rather that it continue advertising auctions, but that it no longer sends certain data in its auction that allow the person who's loading the page or the website to be identified as they travel the internet. So Microsoft would be allowed to send useful information that allows, potential advertisers to decide, do they want to show their ad in this ad space? Will they make a high bid of money, competing with other potential advertisers for their ad to appear in this ad space? That can still work. But you would never be able to profile this person as they travel the internet. You'd never be able to link the data. And what that means is that all of the fraud, the online advertising industry is rife with fraud, with bots pretending to be humans. All of that fraud enabled by the ability to track people, which means you can now pretend bots are people and track them and then bring them back to fraudulent websites and then attract advertising money to the fraudulent website. That would be broken entirely. So this solves a huge fraud problem. And it would also stop the intermediary tech firms from charging outrageous hidden percentages, but we have a sense of what they are, every time that they enable an ad to be shown. And we can talk more about that point if you wish, but maybe you don't, so I'll stop.
I do. And that was exactly what I wanted to ask you. As a matter of outlining the machinery of online advertising, usually, stereotypically, when online advertising word or phrase emerges or pops up, we immediately associate it with the largest player, with Google. Real-time bidding and all the infrastructure, double click and all the things. And latest cases remind us about it in different jurisdictions. We also know that there is kind of internal system in Meta. We also know that Amazon is quite active and Microsoft.
Yes.
Can you give us kind of an outline, maybe a summary of maybe a comparative perspective about these four and maybe other systems? Do they interact with each other? To what extent? I imagine it require a separate lecture, but at least maybe some highlights so that we have a better understanding of the system, the kind of how endemic it is.
Yes. Okay. Well, so the answer is in real-time bidding, they all use a common standard. So there's a common set of rules for what data are sent out. And in some cases, they collaborate. So if you visit a website or use an app and an ad auction occurs, very often it is not a single ad auction, but the company running that auction will trigger other companies to run sub-auctions. The winning bid from the sub-auctions, from the several sub-auctions, you might have 5 or 6 winning bids, they will then compete against each other. And if the company that ran the umbrella auction also ran its own auction, it will compete with their bid. Now, I think it was the Eastern Virginia case, the US Department of Justice case against Google, that revealed chicanery on Google's part, where it was rewarding itself because no one gets to see what the auction runner is actually doing. And also, I think it revealed, was it Project Jedi Blue, where Google and Meta had a nefarious contract to disadvantage everybody else. So you get a very opaque system where a few companies have visibility on both sides of the market. And as the Department of Justice noted in its summation, this is like having Goldman Sachs run the stock market, representing sellers and buyers and having incentives of its own. It's a total mess. So we have a strange situation where online advertising promised at the beginning science to a domain advertising that previously had been an art. People didn't know exactly what worked, but they knew it worked. Now, nobody knows what works. You've got plenty of numbers and metrics. If you're a chief marketing officer, you can now present slides with graphs to the chief financial officer. So you feel better about yourself. You no longer have physics envy. You're no longer an artist, but your numbers are nonsense. I mean, this is like Robert McNamara presenting charts in the middle of the Vietnam War. He is not receiving useful data. Yeah, I mean, really, he ultimately realizes later he had no idea what was happening. So you have the same problem for chief marketing officers. It's a false science. No one knows if a human has seen an ad. And by the way, the only way to know for certain, Oleg, that a human has seen an ad online is if a single ad directly produces a purchase, and if the thing that is then purchased is not returned to the retailer within 30 days, then you know you've shown an ad to a human.
And yet we see how rapidly this market evolves and how considerably the power of traditional media is shrinking in terms of attracting and generating advertisers' attention and investment. You've been claiming that there are so many elements of let's say of vagueness in terms of what figures are presented and how they are inflated. The entire world is being misled somehow.
Well, this does happen from time to time. Perhaps it happens all the time. We have plenty of examples of it. The Big Short was a book and a film that guides you through how it works. Sometimes a few people read the documents and get to see, they pierce the veil. Well, there is now a tear in the veil. Many people in advertising know that there is a deep, deep problem. The loudest voices in advertising are not incentivized to talk about the problem because there's plenty of spare money sloshing around for those who'll play the game. Are you incentivized to reveal fraud at its maximum scale? If you're in a position to know about it at large scale, you are probably an entity that makes money from it inadvertently. But I think you would spend more time selling your product if you had to hire someone. You would hire a person to sell your product, as opposed to hiring a person in your anti-fraud team. Now, if you are one of these intermediaries, the reason you make so much money is because of the promise that the data bring, the promise of science and discounts. You are the last party in the industry who would say the solution is to remove data. In fact, in the anti-fraud tech sector, that small industry is constantly pushing for more data. We need more data about people to know that they're human. Even though they have been thoroughly outfoxed with as much data as they have. So I use the word discount there. Maybe I should explain that, Olish. We have a wonderful example. Maybe I've taken you through it before, but it's worth repeating. From a court case that that The Guardian ran as a publisher against its AdTech partner, who was running the auctions to sell its inventory. So The Guardian ran a court case against a company called, I think it was Rubicon Project in 2017. And to gather evidence, they ran a sting operation. So The Guardian pretended to be a advertiser, set up a fake brand, and they started to buy, using this complicated system and with all the data, they started to buy ads on The Guardian's own properties, guardian.co.uk, for example. And as the advertiser, they could see how much they were spending. And as the publisher, they could see how much they were receiving. For every pound sterling that The Guardian spent, it received 30p. 70% disappeared into the plumbing that this intermediary was plugging them into. So the reason that the intermediary can do that is they are promising efficiency and they're promising discounts to advertisers. What the advertiser is hearing is, you can find The Guardian reader on really cheap websites. So if Olej is planning to buy a yacht and he reads Yacht Monthly, we can find him on crappywebsite.eu and you can show him an ad for a yacht for 20 cents. Now, in the event that occurs and an ad is shown at a huge discount, the yacht advertiser has no idea what the real price of that ad was. They don't see it. So maybe instead of the ad costing €60, it only costs 20 cents. The ad tech company can tell the yacht company, well, it only costs €10. So they pocket €9.40. It's still a discount, still efficiency. Is it efficient to advertise for a yacht on crappywebsite.com? I don't believe so. If you look at, now, Apple is a different company to many others. Where does Apple advertise? Apple advertises outside museums of art. I was in Paris visiting my brother. We visited Centre Pompidou, which is a huge institution with modern art. And as soon as you walk out the entrance, absolutely inescapable, across the kind of plaza area is a huge outdoor banner for an Apple product. At least it was a few years ago, last time I remember visiting. That's advertising that works. Now, a marketer talks about a funnel. The marketing funnel. At the top of the funnel, there's brand awareness, where you kind of build this understanding of the promise of a new life. If I bought an Apple Mac, maybe I'd have taste and sophistication and money. So that's at the top of the funnel. And then at the bottom of the funnel, there's the moment of purchase, that the person saying, sign here. And marketing at the bottom of the funnel used to be junk mail in your letterbox, where they're making a calculation that because you live in low quality housing, you might want a payday loan. So the loan shark puts a bit of paper through your door saying, here, buy a crappy financial product, with a cute character selling it, and a cute name and a cute website. Programmatic advertising most online advertising has moved to the bottom of the funnel because it promised to link transactions to advertising. It promised to have a smooth chain where you could track people across devices and see where they spent money. I mean, turns out we're tracking bots all the way up to the purchase and sometimes into the purchase. They'll probably return the item if it's a very sophisticated bot fraud scheme. But you're not going to find, fraud when you are buying sections of media that humans are visiting. So this isn't just about supporting, really large outlets, really large publications. This is about supporting even niche websites and apps that happen to have the audience you want. There was a time when the job of a media buyer in an ad agency was to know which program, which show in a local radio station in a region of the country is the best one to get commuting parents on their way home for this particular, milk product for a child. That works. It's always worked. You can do it in digital too. But unfortunately, all of the marketing training now, a lot of it comes with a Google badge on it. Are you Google certified? In that case, you are probably ruined for a very large part of effective advertising.
Very convincing. Johnny, my last question is about, before inviting you to provide recommendations to students, is about your plans for 2026, the first half of the year. What are the main things you will be watching and doing in 26?
If I have the budget, and budget is a real problem in the nonprofit sector at the moment. If I have the budget, I will take a case against a major big tech firm that engages with purpose limitation and that has momentous competition consequences. This case would essentially be a functional separation, a data unwinding, and if it achieves all its aims, it would force all large firms to properly account for how they use data internally and to give people control over what companies actually do. So, which things are you going to let this company do? Which bits of this company are you going to reward with your data? If you're annoyed with this company, but you need a particular thing from them, okay, now you're in control. Just imagine at the end of 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the surviving astronaut where the HAL 9000 computer of the spaceship has killed all the other astronauts in this Stanley Kubrick film. The surviving astronaut, Dave Bowman, climbs into the computer's brain and starts slowly pulling brain chips one after the other, and the computer loses its mind. This is how you lobotomize bits of big tech, because they're of no interest to you. They do no favor for you, but you keep the bits that you want as a consumer. That's what I'll be doing. The second case, if I have the budget, is to do, again, what our regulators should have done, and that is to pursue a large social media firm's recommender algorithm. They should not be on today by law. They are prohibited by the prohibitions in Article 5 of the AI Act. They are prohibited as being on by default and under Article 9 of the GDPR, which refers to special category data, the most intimate data about a person, which is what these systems, of course, are processing. But they process it by default. Or if they have some cute follow for you tab, for example, that does not explain what they're actually doing and what the consequences are. And that case would be to protect children and also to protect adults. So budget permitting, two major cases that should entirely change the digital system, but budget's the question. If any large tech firms are listening and want to donate anonymously to their own demise, or I should say reformation, feel free. But don't count that as a true solicitation. The other priority is that Ireland is assuming the presidency of the European Council of Member States in July this year. Ireland is a very interesting European member state. It is a country that never had an industrial revolution nor an industrial base. It was impoverished before it joined the European Union in the 70s. That was a transformative thing. And now, Irish people are, by Irish standards, astonishingly wealthy. We don't have the infrastructure to go with that, but we are astonishingly wealthy. You will see traffic jams of Land Rovers on Dublin streets today. We have won the race to the bottom in Europe. And by being the Trojan horse for Donald Trump today and for China, by allowing some of the most dangerous firms in the world to operate in Europe with impunity, by continuing to be a tax haven for companies like Temu and others, by exposing the children of Europe to unbelievably dangerous algorithmic harm that promotes suicide in their feeds and self-harm. We are betraying the Europe that made us rich, that made us truly independent of Britain. We have betrayed Europe. We are betraying Europe. So I am trying to understand what is to be done during Ireland's presidency. There must be some pragmatic way for Ireland to start thinking about a plan B if the EU-US divide grows even more severe. How does Europe start to actually or how does Ireland start to actually become European? We aren't European. We are American. Americans pay for our prosperity. Europe may have paid for our roads, but America pays for our prosperity. We watch American media. We speak with American slang. We are the most European people in Europe, and in some cases in parts of America too. So I find this moment where Ireland reassumes the presidency of the European Council, it may be a moment of opportunity. I'm not sure what that opportunity is, but I'm thinking about that. And the final point is, we at Enforce will be spending quite some time not only trying to get the European Commission to understand the need to properly monitor Ireland and see that the GDPR is applied against these large firms, but also to aid the capitals and the Commission in thinking about their options so that when they are negotiating with Trump and they're pulling a lever in their minds, what can we do with this guy? They do not have Pascal Lamy repeating Harley Davidson. I mean, that takes you back half a year, right? Harley Davidson, we will put tariffs on Harley Davidson. You know, stuff from term one that actually they have proper hardball things, that they have come to terms with the pain to themselves of those things and the political cost, and that they can make a proper political calculation. You know, that they actually have options when they're confronting Trump, and that they know that it is Europe that can reach under the table and grab Trump by the pussy in the locker room and squeeze hard.
My last question, John, is to invite you to recommend some practical or maybe a moral tips to students, those who just begin their career these years.
Students of competition.
And beyond.
Competition and beyond is what? This is your next course title. I can see it already, Ulrich. I can imagine enjoying it very much. Well, the first question is this domain that I'm studying real? Has it had consequence? When did it become real? If you go back to Peter Sutherland as commissioner, this was a moment when competition took off. I think some would probably agree. And when did it stop? What stopped the competition agenda or changed it? There is a history. Maybe it's better understood than I imagine it is. But I think there's a beginning and an end to competition. Certainly, looking at the digital market, we haven't had it. We haven't had any real assertion of competition. We've had a few attempts, yes, well-meaning attempts. But why hasn't that rule book been asserted? And, that allows a student, I think, to regard this domain with a perspective that meets the real world in its own terms. Then you can start to imagine, what do I want my career to be? There is a well-trodden career in the defense bar, which has an increasingly difficult task. The defense bar not only has to defend its clients, it has to prop up the theater that this is an actual domain where there's hazard for clients. So, every now and again, the defense bar has to run conferences and tell the regulators they've been doing a great job and so forth, and give them prizes, not just to keep them on the side, but to show that regulators actually exist. And sometimes there are regulators then who are straying a bit far, and you need to try and discipline them. So students could be on that side, or students could do something a little bit more interesting. The more interesting thing is to go way back into the depths of competition, where the ideas came from. And Barry Lynn is so good on this. Way back, the Interstate Commerce Act, right? Non-discrimination, those big ideas. And think, what are the levers to make that thing work? Because right now, nobody knows. And if I was a young student, not only where can I go and learn what those levers are, but where could I build a career for myself that is lucrative and has purpose? And, that's the question. You can get the money, but can you get the purpose and the excitement as well? Balancing excitement, purpose, and payment, that's always the challenge.
Johnny, Ryan, thank you for sharing your ideas with us.
Thanks for having me, Olish. And thanks for running this series. It's fantastic that you're doing it with so many people.
I'm very grateful.